Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I find myself in a great deal of agreement with the honourable gentleman, the member for Keighley, who I think has put the case for press freedom extremely clearly. May I begin by making an essentially ancestral declaration of interests. My father was involved with newspapers for most of his professional life, and I have received, in comparison, very modest payments from some newspapers for some works I've provided for them over my time in Parliament. The heart of this bill is actually three amendments, but two primarily, 168 and 169, that came in from the other place, that fundamentally attack the freedom of the press. There is widespread agreement on the need to regulate the digital economy and the ownership of data effectively. There is cross-party agreement on it, and I doubt there will be a division this evening. But the freedom of the press and freedom of speech are absolutely at the heart of our democracy. And members of Parliament should remember that this freedom will be exercised in a way that does not always provide hagiographies for us. Quite understandably, newspapers will say critical things of people on these benches and people on those benches. Sometimes they will be fair, sometimes they will be unfair. Sometimes we will read it and think that we have made a mistake. Sometimes we will read it and know that the newspaper has made a mistake. But that is the flotsam and jetsam of political life. For every piece in the Daily Mail that upsets members opposite, there will be something in the Daily Mirror that upsets us, or in the Guardian. And that is how political life works, and we surely are not sufficiently of the snowflake generation that we should mind about that. That is how political life must and should go. And then we look at clause 168 and 169. And we know from our history that one of the tactics of dictatorial regimes is to have punitive damages levied on newspapers that do not do what they want. To have a system where if you lose a libel action, you are effectively closed down. Why do they do that? They do that so they can have the pretense of freedom of speech with the reality of control. We know from our own history that in the 18th and in the 19th century, libel laws were used to prevent the press from exercising the freedom that we think of as a constitutional birthright. We know that the Americans, when writing the Bill of Rights to their Constitution, made the Second Amendment a very clear statement of freedom of speech. Why? Because it was in response to the abuses that they thought were taking place in the United Kingdom at that point. They put it in because they're worried about things like the persecution of John Wilkes and his being sentenced to prison, not for what he did, but for what he said. And we see that being restored in clauses 168 and 169. The outrageous, the monstrous idea that if you print something that is entirely accurate, every dot and comma is true, but you have not bended the knee to officialdom, your fine will be to pay your own costs and the costs of the party about whom you will tell the truth. You have told the truth. The honourable gentleman, the member for Keighley, referred to the Daily Mail and the Lawrence affair. The Lawrence affair, the Daily Mail, that terrifying right-wing newspaper, which I read every day and enjoy, exposed the murderers of Stephen Lawrence in a way that required them to say things about the murderers that, until double jeopardy laws were changed, could never be proved in a court. What if this law had existed then, and those people we now know were guilty of murder had sued the Daily Mail for saying something that was true, and had had to pay the costs of murderers? That is what their noble lordships have put in to this bill. But it is more serious on a day-to-day basis than the worst case that I can think of. We know the weakness of our local papers. We know how they struggle hand to mouth. But dare I say, how easy would it be for any one of us, my honourable friend, the member for Leinster, for example, who's not in his place anymore, to take to court the journal that he doesn't like because it said things about him that aren't accurate, and that's fair enough for him not to like them. But if an honourable member took a local paper to court, that local paper would be insolvent, because many of them don't have powerful parents behind them. Many of them, and I think of some in my own constituency, are run by entrepreneurial individuals trying to make a reasonable living. And the threat that they would have to pay double costs would be sufficient to stop them printing that story that was disagreeable about us. Well, that's great. That means that in all Conservative seats, no disagreeable things will be published about Conservatives, and all Labour seats, the same will be true. And therefore, I remain the representative of North East Somerset forever and ever, amen, amen, alleluia, and the honourable gentleman for Keighley remains in Keighley likewise. But as it happens, both of us think this is fundamentally wrong and an attack on democracy. Free speech is not there so that Rupert Murdoch, a man I greatly admire, can make a great deal of money. It's not there so that the noble Lord Rothermere, can likewise make a decent living. It's there because it is the pillar of democracy. And if we do not have it, how can you expose corrupt governments, incompetent politicians, and dare I say it, there are some occasionally, governments that make mistakes? How do you expose that? Councils that get things wrong, errors that are made, dishonesties that are performed. Where are these going to go? How are these going to be reported if every one of us can shut down our local newspaper just by saying that we will go to court and they will have double costs? Now, the proponents of these two clauses will say that's all very well, but there's impress. But what is the fundamental principle that has prevented newspapers signing up to impress? A principle that I was one of 13 MPs who voted against the bill allowing this to happen, and feel that I was absolutely right to do so. A principle that a free press is one that cannot be regulated by the state. And the application to be approved by a regulator, approved by a royal charter, is regulation by the state. And it is not comparable with the judges or other organs of the state that are independent, because the judges are part of the state. They are simply independent from this place and from the executive. The whole point of the press, it is not in any way part of the press. And so, quite understandably, no serious newspaper of the left or of the right has been willing to bend the knee to impress, and nor should it. Because now let us turn to looking at impress, what causes it, what its origins are, and who funds it. Because this is a scandal of our time, that their noble lordships should have put into law a piece of legislation that has been pushed, harried through by perhaps one of the most disreputable figures in British public life. I refer, of course, to Mr. Max Mosley, who has provided £3 million for impress, and who took a libel action against the News of the World when they said that he had indulged in Nazi-themed orgies. The News of the World was wrong. The orgies were not Nazi-themed. They were orgies, but they were German-themed. I do apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, for saying these shocking things in front of you. But that is what happened. And the News of the World lost, and it was deemed that his privacy had been invaded. Before that, very few of us had heard of him, except that we knew vaguely he was involved in Formula One, and that we knew his father had been a member of Parliament, a Labour member of Parliament as it happened, and then set up the British Fascist Union. But we did not know that Mr. Mosley held views himself, or had, he claims in the past, held views himself that I think no reputable person could possibly hold. And views that are so repellent that, though I am going to read them out, Madam Deputy Speaker, I read them out with very considerable reluctance, but I think it is important to understand what underpins impress. Because Mr. Mosley was the authoriser of a leaflet. And we all know, because we've stood for Parliament, how important the authoriser of a leaflet is. I have the most wonderful agent, Margaret Brewer from Somerset, referred to in the Sunday Times as a feisty, flinty rural matron, and indeed she is. But nothing goes in my leaflets without her approval. You may think I'm independent-minded, but I have not a view, Madam Deputy Speaker, that has not been approved by Mrs. Brewer. And so I know, and we all know, how this works. If our agent doesn't approve it, it doesn't go in. And what did it say? And as I say, this is so appalling that I am reluctant to read it out in Parliament. But under a heading, Protect Your Health, it said, there is no medical check on immigration. Tuberculosis, VD, and other terrible diseases like leprosy are on the increase. Coloured immigration threatens your children's health. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the view of the funder of Impress. It is little wonder that our free press does not want to be associated with such a man. It is little wonder that, to its credit, the Labour Party has now refused to take any further funding from this man. But Impress has not. Impress has not condemned this man. It has not said that they will refuse further funding from the charitable trust he set up purely and specifically to keep Impress running. They have done nothing of this kind, and they have a reputation of their own. And there is a certain irony in this. Their chief executive is a man called Jonathan Hayward, and he tweeted, of all things, that the Daily Mail was a neo-fascist rag. Well, dare I say that he might know a good deal more about neo-fascists than one had thought when that tweet was originally circulated. We are suggesting under clauses 168 and 169 that that most precious thing, which underpins and protects and gives us our democracy, should be sacrificed to the honour of a man who has waged a campaign against freedom of the press because it exposed his perversions. That is the long and short of it. And the honourable gentleman, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party and Shadow Secretary of State, said that Mr Mosley doesn't hold those views anymore. Well, how gracious of him. But how fortunate we are that our free press has exposed those views so that we know them in the context of the debate that we are having today. And I say to members opposite that any of you who go through the division lobbies at a later stage to vote in favour of those clauses are voting to support Max Mosley and his abhorrent views and his money. Those of us who believe in freedom will vote them down.